Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session, Update Required, Fixing the Tech Sector's Role in Conflict. We're going to discuss avenues for ensuring that tech companies respect international humanitarian law, as well as evolving international norms and standards regarding the role of private sector actors in conflict. I have three fantastic experts here that are going to help guide us through the discussion today. Get prepared. This is going to be quite active. We have mics here on either side of the room, so we expect a lot of audience participation, given all the expertise as well out there and online. First, we have Marwa Fatafsa from Access Now. She leads their policy and advocacy work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa, and she's written extensively on the digital occupation in Palestine and focuses on the role of new technologies in armed conflicts. We also have Chantal Jordis from Article 19. She is the senior legal officer focusing on platform regulation and freedom of expression in armed conflicts. And we have Kieran Aziz, the head of responsible investments at Norway's largest pension fund, KLP. In her role, she monitors and assesses how investee companies within KLP's portfolios maintain responsible business practices. And my name is Meredith Veit. I'm a tech and human rights researcher at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. At the Resource Center, we systematically track human rights harms that are linked to corporate misconduct, including for the tech sector. And these allegations come from journalists, whistleblowers, digital rights activists, and workers from around the world. And we've logged over 1,490 different data points related to tech and conflict over the past 10 years. Our data shows that technology companies are now deeply embedded in modern conflicts. We've recorded allegations of companies sourcing critical minerals from conflict zones, some even being accused of financing armed groups. Others have been linked to restrictions of freedom of expression by complying with government-ordered internet shutdowns, silencing internal dissent amongst their employees, or disproportionately censoring one side of a conflict. There are also concerns about platforms amplifying calls for violence through their algorithms, and we've registered serious claims that some tech companies are continuing to supply tools and critical infrastructure like cloud services or AI systems or spyware directly to militaries that have been credibly accused of war crimes. At the Resource Center, we're also seeing that tech companies are less transparent about their operations in conflict-affected areas, when the opposite should be true. They should be more transparent about how they're managing human rights risks in delicate contexts, in alignment with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. In 2014, we conducted a survey on heightened human rights due diligence with over 104 technology companies operating in or providing services to the occupied Palestinian territories and/or Israel. And only 3 companies got back to us in detail, actually responding to the questions of the survey, making it nearly impossible to actually determine if and how heightened human rights due diligence is actually occurring at all in a context that has long been exposed to conflict-related risk. This astonishingly low 4% response rate from companies is unprecedented in the Resource Center's history. And previously, we had sent a similar survey to tech companies that were operating in Russia and Ukraine, and 26% had responded by comparison. And of course, both of these numbers are abysmally low, 26% and 4%, which means we need more transparency about what's actually going on. Over the past couple of months, we've also reached out to 7 tech companies concerning credible allegations of facilitating war crimes, and only 2 of them have been willing to engage with us and provide further transparency. At the moment, there are more than 110 armed conflicts taking place around the globe, and all of our headlines are covered with various conflicts going on at any given moment. And broadly speaking, across a number of sectors, we're seeing that all too often companies are not just profiting from conflicts, but they're exacerbating them, furthering harm, fueling calls for violence, and in some cases facilitating war crimes and gross violations of international law. We only have a handful of instances where we've seen corporate accountability for aiding war crimes and crimes against humanity playing out in courtrooms and cabinet rooms and boardrooms, whether it's convictions or sanctions or investors diverting funds from those that don't uphold their responsible investment principles. And we're going to talk about a few of these things today, such as governments placing export controls on companies that are selling dual-use tech to maligned actors. There's currently a stakeholder resolution before Alphabet requesting that the company carry out heightened human rights due diligence regarding its operations in conflict zones. And there are a number of Norwegian investors, some of which are here, including KLP and Storebrand and NBIM, that have excluded multiple tech companies for concerns over their misconduct in relation to conflict in international law. And while these examples are incredibly important and noteworthy, and hopefully we'll surface even more examples during this discussion today, these should not be the exception. Guaranteeing that tech companies are not involved in breaching international humanitarian law should be the minimum requirement. And for the tech sector, we have yet to set a strong enough precedent for accountability for international law violations. As of now, no major tech companies or executives have been criminally convicted for violating international humanitarian law, although there is mounting evidence, and as we know, tech companies are not neutral actors in many conflicts. So we're going to spend the rest of our time today, about 50 minutes, discussing this topic together and diving into more about what's needed for greater corporate accountability for the tech sector's largely unchecked and increasingly powerful and pervasive role in conflict. So we can start off with our expert interventions, and then we'll open up to the floor to talk a bit further together. So first, I'll start off all the way to my left with Marwa, asking her to kick us off. Can you reflect a little bit more on different ways in which tech companies have been involved in conflict, and have we seen any meaningful positive change in regard to corporate behavior in response to civil society or regulatory pressure?
Thank you very much, Meredith, and thanks everyone for attending this session. I will start with the point you ended with, to emphasize on the point that, or on the fact that tech companies are never neutral actors in situations of armed conflict. They exacerbate the dynamics of the conflict and sometimes even drive them or fuel them, particularly in contexts where there are asymmetries of power between warring parties. They can facilitate human rights abuses or even, in some cases, contribute to atrocity crimes. I have been primarily focused on the unfolding genocide in Gaza over the past year and a half, so most of my examples will derive from this particular context, which is important because in some ways it might be a foreshadow to the future of warfare and cyber warfare and the involvement of tech companies, and I'll expand on that in due course. But I can summarize the ways in which tech companies have been involved in conflict in three notable patterns. Firstly, tech companies can be responsible for directly causing adverse human rights impacts that undermine or violate people's rights, including the right to freedom of expression, right to peaceful association and assembly, right to bodily security, non-discrimination, among other rights encoded and enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also economic and social and cultural rights. An example of that is what you mentioned with regards to censorship on social or by social media companies and the systematic removal of Palestine-related content online. The second trend is that some companies indeed can contribute to adverse impacts via third parties, such as, for example, the Israeli government, or could be another military. Companies provide direct technological assistance, products, services in the context of Gaza. This includes cloud computing services, AI tools such as LLMs, facial recognition technologies, among others, which have been linked to egregious violations of international law, gross human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and possibly the crime of genocide, which is pending before the International Court of Justice. And here I want to mention maybe just a few examples. We know, for instance, that Google So Google and Amazon, they have this $1.2 billion project providing a national cloud service or infrastructure to the Israeli government called Project Nimbus. During the war, or the start of the war, those services have surged in demand. So we know that Google has deepened its business relationship with Israel, particularly with the Ministry of Defense in March 2024, and provided with them with a landing zone. They even created, according to media reports, a classified team composed of Israeli nationals with security clearances, specifically tasked with receiving sensitive information from the Israeli government, and also to provide specialized training with government security agencies and participate in joint drills and scenarios tailored to specific threats. Amazon Web Services also had provided, according to media reports, provided Israel's military intelligence with server farms that allow for endless storage for mass surveillance data that Israel has gathered on almost everyone in the Gaza Strip. And beyond supplying cloud infrastructure, according to media investigations, they have on occasion directly assisted the IDF in verifying targets for airstrikes. Other media investigations show that the use of Microsoft Azure cloud and AI technologies have also surged, up by 60% in the 4 months of the war compared to, for example, September 2023. The same can be said about OpenAI. So this is just to demonstrate that the services they provide are substantial in nature, indicated by the surge and high demand that we've seen across these different companies. And also another point that I would like to mention is that this is not only about providing technological support, but actually providing human resources, trainings, joint exercises. For example, some leaked documents from Microsoft had shown that the Israeli Ministry of Defense had purchased approximately 19,000 hours of engineering and consultancy services from Microsoft. And Microsoft teams had provided on-site, so on military bases, as well as assistance and remotely, to the IDF, including to units called Unit 8200 and Unit 9900, which are notorious for surveillance and military surveillance in particular. A third trend or way in which the companies or tech companies can or are involved in armed conflict is sometimes tech companies can contribute to adverse impacts in parallel with a third party, in this case, with the Israeli government or the military, leading to cumulative impacts. And for instance, a number of tech companies have mirrored Israel's state policy of apartheid and segregation in the way they provide or prohibit or withdraw their services to the Palestinians. One clear example of that is, for instance, Google Maps, which if you use it in the West Bank or in the occupied Palestinian territories, it only treats you as if you are an Israeli settler. So you're only given roads and maps that connect Israeli settlements, but you're not given any roads between, for example, Palestinian towns or villages, putting people at direct risk, safety risk. PayPal is another interesting example where if you are an Israeli settler living in an illegal settlement, you can access, for example, PayPal financial services. But if you're Palestinian, you're deprived of that service, which contributes to the development of the Palestinian communities and economy, something that has been written about by the World Bank and other UN agencies, showing again the degree in which these tech companies, by depriving or refusing to provide their services for whatever reason to communities that are going through a situation of military occupation, for instance, can contribute to that, to the cumulative impact of the occupying power or the policies that they have enshrined in that area. To your question, have we seen any positive shifts? Quick answer, no. Unfortunately, and particularly in the Palestine context, the survey that you have shared in the beginning is really an experience that we share ourselves. We have written letters to and have tried to meaningfully engage with tech companies to point out, first to point and show evidence, a body of evidence of the harms that they are directly or indirectly contributing to. But most of those attempts has gone unproductively. We haven't gotten any productive answers from the companies with regards to their conduct, or, for instance, they were unable to even answer very simple questions such as, have you conducted a heightened human rights due diligence in order to mitigate and identify and mitigate such harms? There's zero transparency with regards to that conduct, but also even when they do succumb to pressure. For example, Microsoft had recently issued a statement after a year and a half of public mobilization, not only from civil society, but particularly from their tech workers, in which they said, well, we conducted an audit to see whether our technologies have contributed to harm or targeting of civilians in the Gaza Strip. And while we don't have an insight into how our technologies are used by Israel, especially in air-gapped military bases, we concluded that we have not contributed to any harm. And that contradiction in itself shows you how even UNGPs have, when companies say we're going to do a heightened human rights due diligence, that results in a box-ticking exercise where they really don't have any insight or ability to control how their technologies are being used. Finally, I do want to end on a note that I think quite the opposite of where we want to see companies going. There's a surge in increasing militarization of civilian tech provided by those companies. For example, both Google and OpenAI have both quietly dropped their voluntary commitments earlier this year not to build AI for military use or surveillance purposes, signaling their readiness to deepen their ties with the arms industry. Within a month of amending its AI principles, Google signed a formal partnership with Lockheed Martin, one of the biggest defense contractors in the world. OpenAI, which maintains a non-profit status, also announced a partnership with a defense tech company called Anduril to deploy its technologies in the battlefield. Anduril and Meta are also partnering to design, build, and field a range of integrated virtual reality products for the US military. And last week, there was a very disturbing announcement that senior executives from high-tech firms, specifically Meta, OpenAI, and Palantir, are joining the US Army Reserve at a new unit called Executive Innovation Corp in the rank of lieutenant colonels to provide tech advice for the US military. So there we see a trend where not only tech companies are providing militaries with their services, but are actually possibly even combatants or taking an active role in the military, which has implications that Chantal maybe can...
This is a perfect segue. Thanks, Marwa. Chantal, can you tell us a little bit more about, amongst these blurred lines and confusing commitments and changing the definition of what actually is a tech company, what is a defense company, and are they one and the same now? What does the law, hard law, actually tell us when we're talking about international humanitarian law? And what friction exists in applying IHL to companies? And how does this relate to other existing frameworks that should be helping to guide states and companies like international human rights law?
Yeah, thank you, Meredith, and thanks everyone for joining. I will try, to unpack some of these questions a little bit. I think there's a few interesting developments also that Marwa mentioned. One thing I remember, I believe it was in Washington Post, where there was the headline of the social media company Meta is providing these virtual reality products for the US military, and I was like, well, is it then still really a social network? Like these companies are clearly merging into something so much bigger, and that has obviously been going on for a long time. And also when we look at this increased integration into the military, legally speaking, I think it also raises some quite significant questions around attribution. So we think about, where does it sit, and does it become a state obligation if a Meta executive operates within the military, then again, okay, he might be a combatant, but also it gives rise to state obligations directly. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of questions that are based on the facts that become more merged and become more complicated to answer. Maybe I will first talk a little bit about the legal obligations and then about thoughts when it comes to enforcement. And I think we need to look at sort of both international humanitarian law and human rights law, because in a sense they are different in their application, and although they both apply during armed conflicts, but also in that sense there's different opportunities for enforcement and accountability, I would say. So, for example, when it comes to humanitarian law, of course, it starts applying in times of armed conflict, non-international armed conflict, international armed conflict. And it's actually more sort of used to apply to actors that are also not state actors. So be it like non-state armed groups, but also to individuals. And applying it to companies, it wouldn't necessarily directly apply to a company, but it does apply to individuals that operate within a company when those business activities have a nexus to an armed conflict. And as we've heard now, traditionally speaking, you might be thinking more of a mining company that is on the ground, or a private military security company that is on the battlefield. But with these technology companies, they might have seemed a bit further removed, but they are increasingly so closely intertwined with how these battles are fought with the military that I think there is in many cases, obviously always context dependent and so on, but a relatively easy point to make that there is this nexus to an armed conflict. And so that means that the staff, in that sense, also would also be bound by IHL. And at the same time, human rights law is we have this very famous soft law instrument of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which more prominently speaks about human rights than humanitarian law. But in terms of hard law, you would be, it's more established as long as we don't have a business and human rights treaty, international treaty. It's of course more established for state actors. And that also translates in a sense into a bit of a difference when it comes to enforcement. So when you look at enforcement and accountability in terms of humanitarian law, you will primarily think about international criminal law. Or let's say, I mean, I think some people in the humanitarian sector would disagree, because they say enforcement is not only litigation enforcement, but I speak specifically about legal obligations and litigations in that sense. There as well, on the international level, you might be able, under some circumstances, to go to the International Criminal Court. We've seen recently the ICC is at the moment drafting a policy on, the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC is drafting a policy on how cyber conduct might fall under the Rome Statute. And there, you know, at the ICC, you might not have legal persons as such that can be accountable or criminally liable, but corporate executives, in theory, under the very, very high thresholds that are under the Rome Statute, could be liable under international criminal law. So that's on the international level, although probably we still have a bit of a way to go until this is an actual realistic prospect that those are the cases that are actually brought by the prosecutor. Let's see. Let's hope not. On a domestic level, I think not only with respect to tech companies, generally speaking, liability for war crimes for corporate executives is not something where we have a huge amount of case law. There is the Lundin Oil case where we talk about corporate executives potentially being liable for aiding and abetting war crimes. There's also the Lafarge case where it was really the company's liability itself that was at stake. But so these cases are becoming more prominent, but as so often it really depends on the domestic framework. Do we have something like universal jurisdiction enshrined in the domestic criminal code? is there, again, potential corporate criminal responsibility, or does it only have to go through the individuals? And depending on that, you know what evidence you might need to provide, you know what legal grounds you need to prove, and you can start building a case. Just to finish up, also, of course, human rights instruments in some domestic jurisdictions, there can be a domestic legal obligation, in a sense, to conduct human rights due diligence, might include heightened human rights due diligence as well. And as well, we have seen cases being brought against companies, for example, against parent companies in the UK over some of their operations in Zambia and so on. And I think that is something where we can learn. How did they bring these cases again? What sort of evidence did they bring? And how can we translate this into the tech sector that is more opaque, probably more intransparent than other sectors that we might be used to.
And this is a great setup for how we're going to open up the floor to questions soon. We're going to discuss kind of what kind of evidence is needed and how can we work more collaboratively to get there. And when it comes to investors, there may be different criteria about what constitutes evidence for investor action. What kind of information do investors typically need, or at what point can investors actually act when it comes to portfolio companies being implicated with regards to allegations of potential violations of international law? Are there any examples that you can talk about from your experience with KLP?
Thank you very much, and not at least for having this conversation, which is much needed, unfortunately. I thought I'll just start by very briefly give an introduction about how we work as investor and what kind of opportunities we have, and not at least limitations. And I think what I will say is mostly the case for a lot of the large institutional investors. And you know, if you look at most of the institutional investors, they have a long-term perspective because they are investing people's pension and saving money. And when you take the long-term perspective into account, it's just not about the financial returns, but it is also some material risk which lies in a company. And this is where we are trying to embedding respect for human rights into our investment decisions. But most of the investors, such as KLP, we are also broadly invested, let's say, in about 7,000 companies in 60 countries. So you can say that all risk which will be out there, we will have an exposure to that. But for us, our mandate, and this is our journey on responsible investment started back for 25 years, and we got the ethical guidelines, but it was mainly driven by our owners, which, you know, they said that, of course, we wanted to make the best return on the money, but we also want to use that tool in order to make an influence on the companies we are invested in. And this is how we develop our ethical guidelines, which involves 3 important tools we have. The first one is that we engage with the companies. This is the most important tool because in order to express our expectations, but also to hold the company's board and management accountable for a company's performance, both when it comes to financial, but also on ESG. And the second tool is to vote in general assemblies, because this is where you, among many other things, you select a board. And we see in more and more human rights, there are coming more and more resolutions in place in these AGMs, exactly because you want to give a signal to the board. And the third one is that we exclude companies when there is an unacceptable high risk for breach on international norms, IHL, and so on. But I would say that the exclusion is really the last tool we have. But nevertheless, it's a really important tool because it also has to do that we as investors, we don't want to be complicit in these human rights breaches. And even if it started with a journey which was on voluntary basis that we decided the ethical guidelines, but it has been a development, I think, which we can be quite pleased about, that these practices are coming into a legal obligation, such as in Norway, we have a Transparency Act, which demands investor to perform due diligence on our investments. And how do we know that there is a risk within a company? Well, you know, we as investor, we rely on information which is in the public domain, and this could be information, of course, from companies reporting, But when it comes to human rights risk, especially in conflict areas, you would see that there are, I wouldn't say the company's resources or in the information or reporting from the companies is a really helpful tool. It's mostly coming from the civil society. And this is where when we engage with on these topics, it's just not about engaging with companies, but it also really vital to engage with vital stakeholders. And the UN High Commission on Human Rights and such as yours have done a really great job in very often conducting reports which tells that companies are present in some conflict areas where they have direct involvement. So, and this is where it is challenging because, as you said, there are about 110 armed conflicts, and it's not necessary that we will have an exposure to all of these. There will be few, such as the war in Gaza, West Bank, Myanmar, Yemen, Sudan, to mention some, where we see the companies play a vital role compared to a lot of other conflicts or wars which have been in the present, such as in Afghanistan and so on. But again, I think our challenge as investor is really much about getting information which can link what's happening of human rights violations up to the company's contribution. And this is where we struggle and we really need help from wider stakeholders and just not the companies. And that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you also look at UNGPs, you would see that performing high due diligence is a really core perspective or the core tool, which is we are also trying to implement in our investments. And when you're a passive investor, let's say you invest in index funds, normally companies become part of your portfolio and then you perform a kind of due diligence later on. But what we have done now, by given that it has been so much focus on UNGP, is that we have started to screen companies upfront. We did that when Saudi Arabia came in as a new market in our portfolio. Then we conducted companies upfront before we decided to invest. And also because due to Saudi's involvement in the war in Yemen. And, you know, we have traditionally been used to work with business models which are quite traditional. The expectations which are there, the standards which are there, are very much tailored for traditional business, armed companies and so on. But you see that the tech companies are playing a much more important role. And we are really struggling, we as investors, to get an engagement with the companies at all. If there is an engagement, it's very often that they would just like to give reference to their policies and they are not really interested in discussing the concrete matter. That's one thing. And the other thing is also, but we are seeing that I would say we as investors, you know, we have some tools, but they are limited because we really depend on that the governments that they take the responsibility. And I think this is a development which is sadly in a direction where less and less government bodies are taking their responsibility, and most of the responsibility is left to the investors and business communities. So and when it comes to conflict areas, we try as much as we can, but I have to say that especially when it comes to tech companies, and I think it's just regardless of KLP, but most of investors we engage with, that we are struggling with getting an engagement with the company at all. And then you sit there, you have information conducted from some of the civil society which says that the companies might contribute, and then you are not able to get engagement with the companies. Well, you know, I would say that the proof of burden would be on the company side, because we have given them a really fair chance to express why their involvement should be seen as a contribution to human rights violation or not. And if they are not responding to our queries, then exclusion would be or first choice. It's not that, you know, we would like to do that, but I think this is where it's really important that when we exclude a company, at least for KLP, we give a quite thorough exclusion document, and this is a way to hold companies accountable. But this is also to help other investors to get insight about where we draw the line between what is acceptable and not acceptable. And I think this is also a way to try to put the companies on agenda and their contribution. And we have seen, we excluded, you mentioned in your introduction, we have excluded a lot of companies. And I think it's just that we are transparent about the exclusion, which had really led that more investors have followed our exclusions. And I think it's also important for the companies to understand that, if they improve their practices, they can be re-included. So I think I would stop there, and then I'm happy to address the questions you might have.
And KLP adopts this very important best practice that not all investors do, which, as you mentioned, is this public list and explanation as to why, clearly citing the human rights harms or concerns with relation to international law, which signals to the rest of the market, right, that in order for funds to flow, you have to respect investor principles and policies with regard to heightened due diligence. So we have about 20 minutes left. So now, with the help of our tech colleagues, we'll put a discussion question up on the board, and we'll open it up to all of you. We want to dive a little bit deeper into this aspect of accountability and enforcement, which we've heard various explanations as to. From different angles, we have different opportunities, different challenges. So the question for all of you is, what kind of evidence would lead to stronger enforcement actions against tech companies that facilitate violations of international humanitarian law, international law in times of conflict more broadly? And we can consider this from the different angles that we've tried to open up discussions about, right? From the different enforcers that have leverage over tech companies are states primarily who need to abide by international law according to their obligations. We have investors who also have responsibility to use their leverage with regard to tech companies within their portfolios according to the UN guiding principles. And we have courts. Strategic litigation is going to be a very key phrase for the coming 5+ years, perhaps. In order to really push for accountability where we can. So with that, feel free to come up to the microphones on the side of the room. We'd like to hear from all of your experiences or ideas or reflections based on what we've just heard as to what kind of evidence, what else do we need in order to start pushing for more enforcement for this sector.
Brave souls out there.
Or anyone online as well. I know we have some people tuning in online.
My name's Anriette Esterhuizen. I work partly with Association for Progressive Communications, and actually we've started a best practice forum in the Internet Governance Forum that's actually also looking at some of these things. I mean, I think the kind of evidence that is really useful is the impact, the stories of what the results are. I think there are many people in the investment digital justice space who might not be aware that this is not just sort of bad actions or irresponsible behavior. It actually can affect people's lives. So I think certainly the stories of what the impacts is. And then I think the other kind of evidence which is also important for civil society is, what are the relationships? What are and I know this can be quite difficult to gather this kind of evidence, but in a way that Marwa was revealing partnerships with Lockheed Martin by different companies, I think that's very useful for us as well. I think it's important to understand how those corporate actors operate, not just in relation to one particular conflict, but what is the kind of the ethical backing or lack of it in how they form partnerships and make decisions about what they do where. So I think different types of evidence definitely, I think, could make it easier for us to to try to hold them accountable. And please do, maybe Marwa can say a little bit about when it is as well. People that are interested in this topic, come to the Best Practice Forum meeting, which will be later this week on Thursday. I think that's the right time. Thanks for the panel, very good.
At 2 p.m. Yes, at 2 p.m.
Hi, my name is Monika Ermert. I'm a reporter. I understand it's difficult to engage with the companies. Is there any pathway from using governments to get them to engage? And then, did you try to engage with them to come here and to sit on that panel? Did you reach out to them? Would be interesting to know.
No, we haven't reached out for them this particular forum, but we have. If you look at a lot of the tech companies, I think if they are placed within EU, it would be easier to engage with the governments, and we try to use that. But if you see that Meta, Amazon, all of them their headquarters are in the US, and I think it's very much linked up to the current administration and how they are perceiving. And I think it's just that international law as such, everything is being challenged at this time. So I think it's very much, I think if you engage with the companies, we saw that it was, at least before this current administration, some of them did an effort, but now it's just like, there are no boundaries for them. And I think it also has to do because they know there is lack of accountability from several places, and there aren't anybody to hold them accountable. And even if I think we as investor, we exclude these companies, I think the vital part here is that these companies have so much influence that I think there is, even if it's a really, really difficult path, but I think it's really important that we and civil society, that we are still there and chasing them, even if they don't want to engage, because we have also heard internally from some of the voices which are internally companies that it helps that investors knock on the door.
I just want to quickly add that, the fact that we're talking about mostly and predominantly US-based companies, the Trump administration is taking an extremely protectionist approach to their tech sector. They see it as a sector that needs to be protected against regulation and accountability, and particularly from the EU, or in fact any other state that may use its national jurisdiction to oblige companies to take one course of action or the other. For example, it caught my attention a couple of weeks ago, an announcement, I think from the State Department, saying that they will not grant visas to foreign officials who have mandated, quote unquote, censorship by these companies. And I think they were mostly referring to the Brazilian judge of the Supreme Court, which, mandated X to take certain action against accounts that are spreading disinformation, if I remember the case correctly. So in such a context, yes, exactly. What do you do? Have we engaged with the companies we have at every opportunity in turn? Not necessarily for this panel, because we know what would be the outcome. They will come here, rehash the same press lines and leave the room. So we can save you and save ourselves that exercise.
And something that we're seeing with regard to power imbalances at play, at the IGF, with so many states here, I think we're also hearing a strong call from all of us in different words that we need states to take tech regulation much more seriously. At the Resource Center, we're constantly reaching out to companies about allegations of harm for a number of different sectors, and the tech sector consistently has a lower response rate than others, like mining or oil or garments. And we think that's because there's less regulation, so there's less pressure. There's been more of a buildup for different sectors and industries over time with relation to business and human rights and states taking action. And for the tech sector, I mean, we see it now within The United States, for example, saying that they want to put a ban for the next 10 years on regulating AI, and calls to try to deregulate in the EU as well. So if we want companies to actually give us the transparency that we need for our societies, we need governments to mandate human rights due diligence and transparency, as we've heard.
I mean, one thought is also, it is also about government transparency, because a lot of times we hear that there are direct service contracts procurement, which is very much a service, again, provided to a government. If you look at freedom of information, access requests, often you would have like a national security exemption. So even starting with, and often for litigation, for example, what you need is really the hard facts. You need the contracts, you need the clause, what exact service provision, what did they say about potential violations of international law. You would even need internal minutes, what, you know, was the executive aware of certain risks and so on. So you really need, of course, I agree that the impact, of course, to prove the impact, and you need this public reporting by civil society, but you also need a lot of information that unfortunately relies often on whistleblowers, on journalists. But again, looking at the fact that there's many governments that attend IGF, I think government transparency is also a very good point to start. Of course, again, questions around defense, national security are prone to find justifications in secrecy due to national security concerns, but it's where accountability efforts can start, and where we can also measure whether states are upholding their own international obligations.
I saw we had someone coming up to the microphone here as well. Yeah, please.
Hi, everyone. Audrey Mokley from Open Mic. Thank you so much for your panel. My question, and you kind of just touched on it, was around to what extent there's a defense of due diligence for these corporate executives or the company itself in international human rights law, and to what extent you would need that kind of evidence of the due diligence being done on the corporate side, and how much detail you would need it. Because I think, you know, we've seen in our engagements with certain companies, they won't even tell us who they hired as a third party to do the assessment. They're very opaque about how the due diligence is being done. And so I guess my question for you is what's the burden of proof there, and how do we place it onto the companies? Is it through the investors? Is it through the states? Thanks.
I mean, around the burden of proof, again, to sound boring, this is always, I think, generally speaking, very much on the domestic law. What sort of litigation do you bring? Is it a tort law? Is it a criminal complaint? So I think that would depend, maybe. And also, again, the burden of proof, the granularity of the information that you have. I will say in some jurisdictions, notably UK, US, there is also the possibility of making the disclosure requests, right, where the judge can then order also the company to disclose certain information that is necessary to be able to actually adjudicate the claim properly. So again, I think one needs to be really quite granular and creative, and really think about all the different means you might have to be able to collect what you need for the case. And then again, it will depend on the exact legal basis, what exactly the chain of causation that you might have to prove, and how you can access that information as much as possible. But it remains a challenge, which is a reality, of course.
I can say from investors' point of view that we work on a risk-based perspective. So for us, we need to know that there is a risk, and then this is why we need to assess how high is the risk element. So I would say the bar is lower compared to if you have to have a litigation in the court. But when that's said, I think it's still important that the evidence which is coming, or the reports which are conducted, that they are done by trustworthy actors, which we can rely on. And I think if more actors would emphasize the same risk, then it gets really clear for us that this is something we need to take into account.
Just So I don't know what she said. I mean, in the absence of legally mandated human rights due diligence, so if we follow the UNGPs, it's a risk-based approach as well, right? So when you have heightened risk because of armed conflict, of companies contributing to gross human rights abuses and violations of international law, then that exercise, the need for it also becomes heightened. The problem here is that often companies are left to their own devices, making their own decision whether they should conduct a heightened human rights due diligence or not. And that is often, I think, necessitated by either media scandals or push from civil society. And one example I can give here is Meta's human rights due diligence into their content moderation of Palestine and Palestine-related content in 2021. That was a strong push from civil society and also their oversight board to see whether their actions had resulted in violating human rights, which in the beginning of that engagement, the company pushed back very strongly against taking that approach and saying, we will internally investigate. I think that's the company's favorite phrase to say, we'll take care of that. So they are not independent. They're not, we don't also know who they've talked to. Because some decisions made by companies, for instance, whether to build a data center in an extremely suppressive and authoritarian state like Saudi Arabia, where the company said, we've done our human rights due diligence. But if the outcome is to say, green light this project, then there are, of course, huge question marks raised about that exercise, meaning what kind of questions have they asked? What risks have they interrogated and scrutinized? And who are the people they're talking to? Are they talking to the rights holders? Are they talking to the impacted communities? Or are they talking to some international NGOs that are not directly linked or really understand the context? Which makes these types of, I would even call that it's watering down what UNGPs were supposed to achieve ultimately.
Okay. I'm given the 4-minute signal. Any other inputs?
There is.
For the audience on yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Sadhana. I just had a quick question on the enforcement front. We heard from the panelists about the relevance of international criminal law and IHL as well. But in situations like in Palestine at the moment, when genocide is so inextricably linked to armed conflict, I wanted to know whether the Genocide Convention imposes any additional duty on private actors and companies to act positively to prevent genocide, and whether there are any enforcement lessons from that convention that might also help us understand how corporate accountability might function where genocide happens in the context of an armed conflict.
So, good question. So I think the Genocide Convention, as you say, of course, there can be a risk to genocide happening, or genocide might already be happening, but the Genocide Convention's obligations are triggered well before we have established whether a genocide is happening in the context of an armed conflict or outside of it. And there is the state's obligations, of course, to ensure also that no one under their jurisdiction would be contributing to genocide or incitement to genocide and so on. I'm not sure. So I wouldn't say it's a direct legal instrument that you can, because it's a state treaty, that you can at the international level at least base yourself on to hold companies accountable. Of course, again, many states have in their domestic legal frameworks also established genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes as crimes, and connected with potential universal jurisdiction clauses. They might be able to pursue companies under those provisions. As I mentioned, as far as I'm aware, I think it's been more war crimes-based complaints, criminal prosecutions, or for crimes against humanity. I'm not sure I'm aware of a corporate executive or a company directly facing genocide charges, let's say, recently post World War II. There was also the Rwanda Tribunal, of course, and so on. But then we talk again more about individual criminal responsibility. But still, I think learning from the cases brought in other sectors and as you say, under crimes against humanity provisions as well is definitely something that we should do if we seek to look at strategic litigation also in the tech sector, I would say.
Mm-hmm. But the Genocide Convention, I think, criminalizes. I think the Genocide Convention criminalizes complicity in genocide, which I think in the Rome Statute outlines what the modes of liability are.
But basically it says the states should, on the domestic level, criminalize complicity in genocide.
Yeah.
Exactly, so
Yeah.
that's what you need to go through, yes.
And in looking across different sectors too, I mean, seeing what exactly was it that had the Dutch businessman who was selling chemicals to Saddam Hussein's regime. What exactly was it about the sharing of information about individuals with the Argentinian regime, with the Ford Motor Company case? You know, what are these pieces that we could take from case law and other previous jurisprudence and actually apply it to tech? Because, you know, in sharing names and personally identifiable information, this can translate to sharing names and biometric IDs in the modern context. So we are definitely out of time at this point, so I will just thank our fantastic panelists and for everyone who participated in the audience. Hopefully this served at least as a launching point to spark some ideas and get more people involved in thinking about this, because as you can see, there's a lot of work to be done from all angles. So thank you all so much for your time and for your interventions today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.